Easy Explain, Zen Buddhist Philosophy, Introduction and Overview. So to kick things off here, I really just want to point out a Zen reading list I've put together. This comes from my own reading over the last 15 years. I came up with 10 texts here, 10 books. I've enjoyed them all. I recommend them all. I want to preface with this, though, to give a bit of a context as to just, where I could be speaking from, just what's going through my head, what's rattling up in the old noggin, and, they're also in chronological order as I went through them here. For the most part, though, we're going to be pulling from The Three Pillars of Zen by Philip Kapleau and Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind by Shunryu Suzuki. The Three Pillars are a great organizational system to talk about Zen, thanks to Kapleau, and Suzuki also divides Zen into 3 parts, essentially. I think they're very, comparable, they're very complementary, and I think it'll give us a good structure to kind of work through Zen, give a proper introduction to Zen. But, if you're interested, here's a lot of other resources you could read and look into. So just that being said, moving quickly through a brief preface there, very, very brief history of Zen. So we're starting with Buddhism, right, which is emerging from historically, traditionally India. Then we're going to introduce the historical, traditional Chinese school of thought known as Taoism, right? That's its own philosophy. More on that later for beginners, for an introductory. And we're going to essentially start to fuse them. We're going to have a blending of these schools of thought, a blending of these philosophies. And when we look at very old texts, some of these historical documents, we see this sect emerging first on continental Asia. It's called Chan Buddhism at first. It's not so much used anymore. It's more of a historical note. But then as Chan Buddhism leaves the continent and finds its way to Japan, it's really first in Japan that we see this school of thought being referred to as Zen Buddhism, as Zen Buddhist philosophy. So just a brief trail of breadcrumbs there to finish as we move from India through China and into Japan, and how these two schools of thought are coming together and becoming their own new synthesis known as Zen. So again, just a brief structural point here, pulling from Kapleau and pulling from Suzuki, those 3 pillars and those 3 parts. So for Kapleau, he calls it teaching. Right, that's the first pillar of Zen. For Suzuki, it's the right attitude, and I think those 2 things go hand in hand, very complementary here. Moving to the second pillar, or the second part of Zen, that is the right practice for both of them. That actually aligns really well in the case of these 2 texts. And finally, for Kapleau, we see the third pillar being enlightenment, or Zen-lightenment. And for Suzuki, we see the third part being right understanding, right? And he's pulling from Suzuki's largely pulling from the Noble Eightfold Path here, going back to Buddhism. The right attitude, the right understanding, those 8 virtues, those Buddhist virtues we're trying to embody and practice. So that's a brief outset of how we're going to be using these 2 texts to inform this playlist. And a note on the playlist. First of all, this is really building from and following up to the Buddhist philosophy playlist on this channel. I highly recommend you go through that first. That is the foundation. That is implied. We're not going to be going over that again. We're really picking up and running with Zen here. That being said, we're starting with the brief introduction over here. Then we'll look at those Taoist influences, right? So we're going to see what is fusing with Buddhism to kind of give us this Chan Buddhism. So that will be when we then look at early Zen thought. We'll see some Chan Buddhist selections and also some very early Zen Buddhist selections once it makes landfall into Japan. And then we'll actually look at the 3 pillars, or the 3 parts, each in their own right, in their own turn. And that's where this playlist is going to go. So the main idea here, it's going to sound very Buddhist, it's going to sound very Buddhistic, especially if you've gone through the first playlist, is that Zen is the wide, all-encompassing gate of compassion. And that's from Kapleau. He's really not changing Buddhism too much in this sense. He's pulling from that for Zen as well. They're adopting that right into Zen. So while it is its own standalone thing from your more general overview kind of level Buddhist philosophy, there's a lot of things in common, and we're also going to see some differences as we get into Zen as well. That's just the main idea. We're still in that ballpark of compassion. And for the purposes of our introduction, our overview, I'd like to share a longer passage, longer quote from one of my favorite writers, Tom Robbins. Tom Robbins he's a huge fan of Zen himself. He incorporates Zen philosophy, Zen ways of thought into his own writing, and I think he does a really good job at, in his own style, in his own fashion, kind of painting the picture of what this philosophy, what this school of thought is. So Robbins says that Zen wisdom is the opposite of conventional wisdom. It is the wisdom that deliberately swims against the current in order to avoid being swept along in the numbing wake of bourgeois compromise. Wisdom that flouts taboos in order to undermine their power. Wisdom that evolves when one, while refusing to avert one's gaze from the sorrows and injustices of the world, insists on joy in spite of everything. Wisdom that embraces risk and eschews security. Wisdom that turns the tables on neurosis by lampooning it. Zen wisdom is the wisdom of those who neither seek authority nor willingly submit to it. So, very fun, right? Tom Robbins has a very fun style of writing. But to point out this phrase of joy in spite of everything, right? It's almost paradoxical, right? It's definitely paradoxical in the sense of while everything could be bringing you down, you're still going to find joy in it. Somehow, some way, in some Zen way. And that really, I think, sums up a lot of the Zen viewpoint as we will continue to get into in this playlist. So for now, that's an introduction and overview. The next step, we're going to be looking at some Taoist influences. But for now, I hope this helps.